Hi everybody, and welcome to this video which focuses on stress, especially the flight or fight response, as part of the psychological health and wellbeing topic for Stage 2 psychology. Let's get started. So stress is a normal physiological and psychological response people develop in response, obviously, to things that happen in our everyday lives. So daily stress, or things that cause daily stress, are called stressors, and stress is, again, a normal, typical part of everyday life. Where it starts to get serious or negative is when it's chronic stress and it actually starts to be so intense that it has a negative effect on our body. But what this video is going to really focus on are the types of stress and the physiological and biological processes that go into the stress response. So let's first talk about the different types of stress, because often when we see that word, we automatically think it's something negative, and often it is, but not in every single case. So let's talk about what we've got listed here. So eustress is actually a type of stress that is positive, it's helpful, and it's motivating. So eustress is actually something that professional athletes in particular thrive on, and it's the sort of stress that's more linked with a positive emotion rather than a negative emotion. So for example, an athlete being nervous but focusing on their goal before a match or before an event. So eustress demonstrates that stress is not always a bad experience. So if a performer, for example, is waiting to get up and sing or perform at an assembly or, perform in a band or things of that nature, yes, it's natural to feel nervousness and as a response stress, but it's a pleasant type of stress that, again, is more motivating and positive and more based on excitement or happiness rather than negative emotions such as fear and anger or sadness. So speaking of which, distress is a negative kind of stress which leads individuals to feel overwhelmed, anxious, and symptomatic. So what this means is that they will have physical symptoms as well as mental symptoms. So distress can lead to physical onset of headaches and sometimes migraines, irritability, insomnia, and stomach upsets. So even though the same physiological responses often happen, different types of stress affect us in different ways. So eustress affects us in a positive way, whereas distress affects us in a negative way. Then when the distress starts to become more advanced, we get what's called acute stress or chronic stress. So acute stress is caused by daily demands and pressure. This can be very intense, but appears and disappears over a short space of time. So acute stress is short-term stress. It's often very, very intense stress, but it quickly disappears over a short space of time. So a person with a particularly stressful job, for example, may go through acute stress and have very stressful periods throughout the day, but then once the stressor is resolved or it's fixed, the stress disappears. That is acute stress. Now, chronic stress is the body's response to a persistent or long-term stressor, which we typically have no control over. So it's not as intense, but much longer lasting than acute stress, leading to the depletion of the body's natural resources. And this leads to an increased risk of physical and mental health issues. So chronic stress, in other words, is very long-term stress. It's not typically as intense as acute, but it is so long-term and so damaging that it does lead to increased risk of physical disorders, such as increased risk of heart attack and stroke and diabetes, and can lead to the onset of mental health issues such as depression and anxiety, and in some instances PTSD, depending on what's causing the stress in the first place. So these are the different types of stress as recognized in psychology. This is in your workbooks, this table here. So let's look at eustress and distress signs in a bit more detail. So eustress is positive, productive energy, helps to increase focus, it increases motivation, is often experienced again as excitement, as I said before. It feels manageable and it feels pleasant. It involves performance rather than cognitive ability. It is associated with confidence and the expectation of a positive outcome or an exciting event. Whereas distress signs provides restless energy, decreases focus, increases procrastination or avoidance of certain tasks, increases fear and concern as the main negative emotions, feels overwhelming, impairs performance, associated with insecurity and fear of a negative outcome. So stress isn't always bad. It can actually be helpful if it's eustress, but other forms of stress such as de-stress, acute stress, and chronic stress are obviously negative and can lead to very negative outcomes. So let's talk about what actually goes on biologically and according to the biopsychosocial model, obviously the biological part of that when we are stressed. So we've talked a little bit about this already in Year 11 psychology. But stress is a result of our flight or fight response. So when we are stressed, the flight or fight response is triggered. Now, this is obviously a life-saving response that we are all born with. It's innate. But this is the same process or response that is activated when we go through daily stressors, whether it's acute stress, de-stress, or eustress. So the more recent research has also revealed that if there is no hope in defeating or escaping the stressor, our parasympathetic nervous system can cause us to be unable to move. So there is a third component to the flight or fight response, which is fright or freeze. So what this means is that if our body recognizes that there's no hope in defeating or escaping, so we can't run away from it or we can't stay and fight it, we will just freeze. And that's often why people will freeze when they're confronted with a threat of some sort and be unable to move, because the brain and body will recognize that it can't run and it can't fight. So it will freeze as the third option. So our body's response to stress, is controlled by what's called the autonomic nervous system, not the automatic, the autonomic nervous system, which is divided into two sections or comprised of two divisions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So these are some typical symptoms or effects of the flight or fight response. So there's changes to our vision, often our pupils dilate. We get a dry mouth, our heart will beat faster, our adrenal glands will activate. We often get nausea or butterflies in the stomach. Our hands can get quite cold. That's very, very typical. Our thoughts will race. We may become dizzy and lightheaded because of the increase in heart rate leads to an increase in blood pressure. Breathing becomes quicker and shallower. We have bladder urgency because the energy that's needed for our bowel and bladder is needed elsewhere to stay and fight or run. So often people will pee or poop themselves. Palms will become very sweaty to cool us down, to prepare us to stay and fight the threat or run, and our muscles will tense up. So these are all very typical physiological symptoms of the flight or fight response that happens in a very rapid fashion, a rapid amount of time. So our sympathetic nervous system activates the body's response to a threat. Hence, it activates the flight or fight response. So it's our sympathetic division that speeds everything up. So responds to a stress or stressor, I should say. Now, this is useful in the short term, all right? So being stressed isn't always a bad thing. Stress can motivate us, especially if it's eustress, to actually get things done. And it can provide us with motivation, and then that leads to positive outcomes. All right, so our sympathetic nervous system is also useful because if we are indeed confronted with a life-threatening threat, we can obviously stay and fight longer or run away for longer. It prepares us to be able to do that. So this is useful in the short term. It allows us to get things done, stay alert and motivated, and possibly save our lives. It's also responsible for eustress, as I said before. But it's not healthy for the body to be in this high state of stress for very long periods of time. Short periods of time or short bursts, it's fine. In fact, it's quite good. But long periods of time of chronic stress or the activation of the sympathetic nervous system is not ideal. So that's why we have our parasympathetic nervous system to slow down the body's functioning to normal resting levels after the threat or the stressor has passed. This is vital. It's just as important as the sympathetic because it maintains our energy levels and supports everyday needs of the body. So it's our parasympathetic nervous system that calms us back down again once that stressor has passed. So once the life-threatening event is passed, or we've handed in that assignment, or the thing that was stressing us out is now resolved, it's all good now, our parasympathetic nervous system returns us back to normal resting levels. So that is how stress works in terms of the flight or fight response and the different types of stress, like I said earlier. I hope you found this video useful. As always, any questions, let me know.